loss forecaster can produce two different types of analyses, a loss projection and a reserve analysis. Because the loss projection covers a few more steps in terms of the way it gets to that kind of final result, we typically like to cover or demonstrate the loss projection report. Okay, so this is our sample loss projection report, and I'll just step through kind of the different pages of this, what they look like, how you might go about updating them. So this first page here is where you'll enter different miscellaneous information about the forecast that you're producing. You can enter a title, the name of the company it's being produced for. You can select the industry. You can see in here we have services selected, but you can choose between a number of different options in this drop down, like healthcare, higher education, mining, retail, things like that. Those are all included. You'll also select the line of coverage that you're wanting to analyze. In this case, we're going to be looking at work comp, but you can also analyze general liability, products liability, automobile liability. And we have some clients that do this on, or general and products on a combined basis. So we have that as an option as well. You select what methods of estimating ultimate losses you want to use. We'll get into kind of what these represent, what they look like here in just a moment. But in this page, you can choose between the incurred development method, the paid development method, or using both of those. And then finally, you'll choose the exposure here. In this case, we've chosen payroll. You can see you can choose between items like man hours, number of employees, things like that. And this will adjust based on the line of coverage that you select. So if you're looking at GL, you might want to look at things like sales. If you're looking at auto liability, you might look at vehicle counts. So for workers' compensation specifically, you have the choice of using either countrywide national averages, or if you have clients whose work comp programs are specific to certain states, if they're primarily concentrated in Georgia and Louisiana, or New York and New Jersey, or something like that, you can come in here and actually select the different states that they are in and create a weighted average of those different states. And then what that tells Loss Forecaster is to create unique factors based on those state-specific factors and using your weighting that you've provided. This next page is where we'll enter our historical loss data. So in this case, we have 6 years of loss history for this client. And what we've done is entered the start and end, or inception and expiration dates for each of the periods in their loss history. We've entered the evaluation date of the loss run we're using. And we've entered the total unlimited incurred and paid loss amounts for each year. And then since we're using payroll as our exposure base, we're also entering their payroll numbers by year. Okay, now this can scale up and down. You don't have to have 6 years of loss history every time. You could scale this down to 3. You can scale it up to 10 or 12 or whatever. This will kind of expand or compress depending on how much loss history you have available. Then at the bottom here, you'll enter some information about the period that you're wanting to project. Now in this case, we're wanting to project losses in 2021. So we've entered the start and end date for 2021 here. And we're wanting to do so at a loss limit of $250,000 in this case. And just to clarify what that means, that is the per occurrence loss limit specifically. So when you're entering that number there, that is specifically talking about per occurrence limits. While we're on this page, I did want to mention too, Becky and I and a couple of other members of our team are always available if you contact support, if you send an email, call us, anything like that. We're always happy to help in terms of stepping our users through these different pieces of the report and things like that. But we also wanted to mention that we have, in each page, we have this helpful items button. And what that'll take you to generally is a video that specifically is looking at each of the pages in this report. And they walk through, this is a couple of our team members just walking through how you might go about updating each of the pages in this report. We also have these information bubbles here. So if you have any questions about a specific piece of any of these pages as well, we have these information bubbles that you can hover over that'll help tell you what exactly that column or cell or anything represents and how you might go about updating it. All right, this next page here is the excess of limit page. So this is where we'll put in any individual occurrences that are over the loss limit we select, which in this case was $250,000. So just to give you an example, in 2016, we did have a claim that was over the loss limit on an incurred basis. Specifically, it was incurred at $300,000. So we've entered that here. I'll also show you it was paid at $280,000. So it had $280,000 of payments in the loss run that we're using. Okay, so we've entered those amounts on these by hitting these edit buttons here and just entering those specific claim amounts. And what Loss Forecaster does is then looks at those amounts and calculates what the excess portions of those claims are. So again, since we had a $300,000 claim on an incurred basis in this year, Loss Forecaster automatically calculates that $50,000 of those incurred losses are excess. Okay, so we do that for each of the years that we have excess claims. And then after that, Loss Forecaster will automatically deduct the excess amounts from our total unlimited losses that we entered on the last page to calculate limited, incurred, and paid loss amounts for each year. Okay, this next page is the loss development factor page. This is where we use our loss development factors to estimate ultimate losses. And we're going to do this on using two different methods here, the incurred development method and the paid development method. I'll show you what that looks like here. So in this column, we have our limited incurred losses. We're applying an incurred LDF, which is based on the age of the period and the coverage that we've selected. And in the case of work comp, it might also be impacted by the states that we're using. So based on those factors, it'll produce an amount here. And by multiplying those two amounts together, the incurred loss development factor and the incurred losses, we get an estimate of ultimate losses using the incurred development method. So that's happening for each year here. And that same process is happening on a paid basis. So we're looking at our payments for each year, multiplying them by a paid loss development factor, and getting another estimate of ultimate losses based on the multiplication of those two numbers. So we're getting two estimates of what the ultimate losses might be using our two different methods here. And then on the next page, we'll make a selection using those two methods. So by default, Loss Forecaster assumes a 50-50 weighted average of those two methods. But if you want to change that from one method to the other, you can use this bar at the top here and drag it either more towards the incurred method or more towards the paid method. And you can see as I do that, the selected column on the far right-hand side here kind of automatically changes as I move it towards one method or the other. So I'll move it back to the 50-50 here. If you want a specific percentage, you can also type that in here as well into these cells. Or if you want to type in a specific ultimate loss selection, you can just hit the checkbox here and enter losses directly, and that'll let you just type in a selection there as opposed to choosing based on that weighted average. Okay. This next page is mostly informational. This is showing you how our trend factors are calculated. So here in a few pages, we're going to be comparing the losses and payroll amounts for each year to come up with a pure loss rate. And to look at that on a consistent basis, we need to make sure that the dollars on a monetary basis, everything is being calculated consistently. So to make sure that's the case, we apply these trend factors. So this is just showing you how those trend factors are being calculated here. The next page here is the threshold page. So you'll see here that for each year, we have this column that shows the threshold. It shows a specific dollar amount there, and then the loss limit, in this case, $250,000. So what we would do here on this page is for any claims that we have with an incurred loss amount that is between the threshold amount and the loss limit for each of these years, we'll enter that on the far right-hand side here. And you can see, I'll show you this edit button here. We've entered a claim in 2016 that is incurred at $225,000. So because that amount is between the $209,000 threshold and the $250,000 loss limit, we've entered that here. And what that does is it tells Loss Forecaster that when it applies these trend factors, when it's making the trend calculations, it will make sure that this claim trends up to the loss limit, but not over. So it'll trend it up to $250,000, but not beyond it. And again, that's just another way for us to make sure that when we're comparing these years in a couple pages, that we're looking at everything on a consistent basis. Okay. This next page here, this is the trend adjustment page, and this is showing you those trend calculations in action. So in the top table here, you can see the estimated ultimate losses that we've selected for each year. We're applying a benefit level change factor, which is a work comp specific factor. And then we're applying our inflation trend factors here. And by multiplying those three amounts together, we get our adjusted losses on the far right-hand side of this table. Since we have a monetary exposure in payroll, we also want to make sure that we're looking at those consistently. So we're also applying adjustment factors or trend factors to those payroll amounts. And we're getting our adjusted payrolls on the bottom right-hand side here. Okay, so this next page is the pure loss rate page. This is pretty much where everything that we've been working on comes together. This is where everything leads up to. And I typically look at this from the bottom up. So in the bottom table here, we have for each year our adjusted loss amounts and our adjusted payroll amounts that we just calculated. And by comparing those two amounts, we come up with what's called a pure loss rate. And that is an estimate of what you might pay on the losses in each year per every $100 of payroll in this case. So again, we'll look at 2016. For every $100 of payroll that was paid out in this year, we also paid out $1.57 in losses. So those pure loss rates are calculated for each of the years here. And then above that, we calculate a few different averages just to give you an idea of the trends and kind of what's going on in the loss history. So there is a system weighted average, which is essentially just a default weighted average, a straight average of the most recent 2 and 3 years in their loss history, a straight average of all the years, and this user weighted average here. And so what that user weighted average is if you look down here on the bottom right hand side, you see this user defined weight. And so let's say for whatever reason, we had a period in our client's loss history that was anomalous or not especially indicative of what their future loss experience might be. If that was the case, let's say that was in 2016, we could come down here to the user defined weight section, and where everything currently has a weight of 1, it's all equal weighting, we could come down here and put a 0 in there. And you can see that automatically adjusts the user weighted average up top. Okay, so I'll move that back there. That's just a way for you to get a little bit more specific in your analysis if you want to see the impact specific periods are having, or make them more impactful or less impactful. You can do that in the user defined weight column. And then finally at the top here we have what we're going to select for our pure loss rate. So in this case we've selected $1.42, which is exactly our system weighted average. And when you're making the selection, you can either type something in directly, or you can click on any of the averages or any of the pure loss rates shown on the page. That'll automatically populate that box for you. Once we've selected a pure loss rate, we're going to enter our projected exposure amount, which in this case is payroll. So in this case, we've entered $115 million of payroll that we're projecting for 2021. And based on those two amounts, Loss Forecaster calculates the projected losses, which for this scenario is $1.63 million. So what this essentially is telling you is that based on this client's loss history, if they were to have a $250,000 loss limit per occurrence in this upcoming period, then we would expect them to retain about $1.63 million of losses. Okay, just one more page here that I just wanted to show. This is showing the confidence intervals on the left-hand side here and the payout schedule. Now the payout schedule is just an example based on industry averages of what the payments might look like on this period if it was paid out over the next 10 years. And below that, we have a discount calculation. So based on these discount rates that you can customize, it calculates essentially the net present value of those losses, of the projected losses. The confidence intervals here, so just to give you some quick context on what that is, generally speaking, this will vary a little bit depending on the coverage that you're looking at and the specific loss history that you're using. But generally speaking, the expected losses, which is our loss projection, will fall somewhere around the 55th, maybe to 60th percentile on a confidence interval. So what that means is that 55 out of 100 times, if this year were to happen, then the losses would be equal to or less than, in this case, 1,640,000. You can see that grows as we go higher on the confidence interval. So what that essentially is saying is that as you get higher amounts here, you are more and more confident that the losses in this year will be at or less than that amount. A couple of different uses for this that we see. One is showing clients more adverse scenarios, what the losses could look like if things are higher than expected. We also have some instances where certain clients like to book their or fund their projected periods at more conservative levels, maybe somewhere around the 75th percentile. So that's an option in there as well. That's a good way to show off those different choices that they have. Okay, that is essentially once you've gone through all those pages, you have fully completed a loss projection report in Loss Forecaster. I'm just going to quickly show you what that looks like when you produce a kind of final report of that loss projection. There are a couple of options here. The loss projection report is what we call our detailed report. I'll show you what that looks like here in a minute. And the summary report as well. That's another option there. So this is the detailed report that we're looking at here. This is essentially a page-by-page PDF recreation of exactly what we just went through. You can see we've entered our initial data here, our loss history, our excess losses, and I'll skip down to the bottom here just to show you at the end on our pure loss rate page. It shows our loss projection calculation, the pure loss rates that were calculated, the averages, and then a graph showing where your selected pure loss rate stands in relation to their loss history. And then below that, you also have the payout schedule, the confidence intervals, and a graph, again, showing where the expected losses or the loss projection stands in relation to those confidence intervals. Now, let's say you had a client that was not especially interested in all of the background information, all of these pages leading up to it. You could also just choose to show the summary report, which is just a one-pager that just shows essentially the most pertinent results of that loss projection analysis. So in this case, this is again specifically just showing the pure loss rates, the selected pure loss rate, the averages, and then a graph just kind of showing off that loss history. This middle piece here shows that loss projection calculation. And then below that, we have our sensitivity analysis grid. So what this does, it's a good way to gauge the impact that having a higher or lower payroll or having a higher or lower pure loss rate might have on the loss projection. So if, for example, if this company's payroll ended up being about $15 million higher than they were expecting, you can go over on this grid here and show that means they should expect about $200,000 more in their loss projection. Okay, that's just a quick way to gauge kind of how those changes might impact the projected losses. I also want to just quickly mention here that we also have the option to export this analysis into Excel. So if you have any kind of additional manipulations or calculations, things like that you would like to do based on the report you created, you can export it into Excel and just make those changes in the spreadsheets. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up the loss projection report in Loss Forecaster.